honored rabbis, distinguished guests, Excellency the Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, I asked tonight what I could say to you that would be anything new, because after all, I have been talking for Bonds for Israel and about Israel for a long time. I made my first trip to Israel nearly 8 years ago, and I've gone back twice since then. The last time was last March or early April, and it was suggested to me that I tell you a little bit about my impressions on the last trip. I went to one or two places I'd never been to before. To many places I'd been to several times before. To go back, of course, to Israel, when you've been there before, is to try to compare what has happened, what the improvements are, what the changes are. And I think the change that to me is the most remarkable is the change which your investment has brought about. The factories had doubled in size, many of them, since I was there 3 years before. Land had been brought into production. But the most remarkable thing was the change in the way new people coming into Israel were being put immediately on the land where they could live, where they could feel, even if they only had 1 or 2 rooms to start with, that this was their home. I remember the first time, the big camps, they were pretty dreadful places, you know. And I looked at them and I thought, how is it possible that there will not be terrible epidemics? So many people herded together. And the remarkable thing was that they did not have the epidemics. And I also saw what it means to have the courage to take anyone who belongs in a land without thought of whether they are not going to cost the land anything. You know, we in this rich country of ours, even in this year, which the United Nations has named Refugee Year, think rather carefully whether we will accept just a few people who might possibly remain a burden. It's very difficult to get us to take as many people that have tuberculosis as Norway has accepted. But Israel in the first year took one whole boatload of people, and no one on the ship that arrived had sight except the crew. That whole boatload of people was blind. What would we do with a boatload of people who landed and were blind? We would think this a terrible burden. But Israel established a village for them. I went to the village. And it was only a short time since they'd been there. But people who had never before had an opportunity to earn. Once they were blind, they begged. They were earning their living. The Joint Distribution Committee had taught them different trades. They were building their village. They were laying out their gardens. This was a happy place. And I think that beginning has characterized what has happened to people. On the whole, they are happy people. Oh, there have been difficulties. I remember very well one day when I was visiting one of the camps, not on the last trip, because the camps have almost gone now, but I remember a young Israeli official standing with a very fine-looking gentleman in a long white robe with a turban. And beside him, crouching on the ground, was a very sweet-looking but a perfectly terrified-looking little girl. And the young Israeli official was saying, "No, we're very sorry, but you cannot sell your daughter. We are extremely sorry, but that does not happen in Israel. She must go to school until a certain age. Then, if you really need what she can make, why, she does not have to go to high school or whatever the next step was. But then she must go into the army, and there her education will be continued." And the little girl looked terrified. She had been brought up to the idea that her father took care of her up to a certain age, and then she was sold to her husband, and he took care of her the rest of the time. And the idea that she had the responsibility to go into the army, to really be an individual citizen, that was something that was quite new. But little by little, the young Israeli official convinced the very important-looking gentleman that this was the way of Israel. And so it has gone right straight along. The customs that came from many strange countries. Mr. Ben-Gurion told me when I was there this last spring that now there were 100 different countries come together in Israel. And when you think how many children have come together from many different backgrounds, it's really an extraordinary thing that is happening in Israel for people. It takes, I think, a particular kind of spirit and a dedication. And then the response comes from the people. The excitement that you find among young people, I think, comes from the fact that they know they are building a nation. And it's a very exciting thing to be building a nation. Now you've made it possible to do away with the camps, to have people go directly onto their land. But sometimes that land is quite difficult land to develop. The Negev has to be made to flower again. And it takes a great deal of work. Sometimes it takes considerable imagination to really imagine that these rocks are ever going to bring forth trees and fruit and have crops on them again. I know that not this last time, but the time before when I was there, Mr. Ben-Gurion was describing to me his farm. And I thought his wife looked a little skeptical as he told me about the fruit trees and the various vegetables and small fruits that he was going to have on this farm. And finally, I, looking at his wife, said, "Are there really any of these trees there yet?" And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, no, not yet. But you have to have the vision here, and then you make the vision come true." That's what a good many people are doing in the Negev today. And the strange thing is that the vision does come true. I went on this trip for the first time to Adath. I'd thought of Adath. In fact, a friend of mine who'd been able to go down there on the last trip, while I did something else, had told me that Adath was just a few fishing houses. She'd gone to see the young people who were in a camp for preparation for the army, who'd come at an age when they could not go through the regular school and were being prepared to go into the army with as much pre-education as they could get. And so she said, this is just a collection of fishermen's houses. Well, this was only 3 years later, and I didn't expect much change. But Adath today has 7,000 people living there. It has a nice hotel, and they have a number of industries. They've used what they could find, of course, in the mountains around, semi-precious stones, and one of the industries is the making of jewelry. They have a special young lady who has designed different ways of using these chips of stone. Very pretty things they make. And while I was there, they asked me if I'd like to go out to the kibbutz, which was about 7 miles away. And I think they asked me because I had my young granddaughter, 16 years old, with me. And fortunately, she's a child of great enthusiasms and great curiosity. And she once said, oh yes, do let's go to the kibbutz. Well, this was a kibbutz of very young people. You know, if you've had your basic training in the army, you may go to a kibbutz in the Negev to develop the land. And so there were 60 boys and 20 girls under 22 in this kibbutz. And they are doing an extraordinary piece of work. But the exciting thing is, I don't know whether they use the Bible, but as the people in Israel use the Bible for anything, I suppose they discovered the spring which furnishes them with water and irrigates their land, and which also furnishes Adath with a good deal of its water supply by reading the Bible. I find that that is one of the things which helps people a great deal in Israel. And in any case, they have irrigated enough fields so they can grow the fodder, the food needed, for a good herd of cattle and a number of sheep and a great many chickens. So we went first to where they lived, up on top of a cliff, and saw all the cattle except such cattle as was being grazed in the desert. And I said, but they can't get much out of their grazing, you must have to feed them. Oh yes, we feed them. We grow all the food. And I said, where? They took me to the edge of the cliff, and down below were these fields, a green oasis in the desert. And they were very proud of it, because they not only grew all their food for animals and for themselves, but they grew cash crops. And they just finished the crop, which they sent out by air, of lilies and gladiolas. Now they were growing tomatoes and beans. And they told me a very interesting little story. The locusts came across the water from the Arab side to Adath. And in just a matter of a few minutes, they ate everything green in Adath. But someone saw them coming and thought of the kibbutz and telephoned the kibbutz. And these are young people. And they had the courage to gather up every bit of spray material they could find and anything they could use as sprayers. And they went down into their fields. And they fought the locusts, and they won. They kept their green fields. And, of course, I think this was one of the most dramatic things. And I let my granddaughter go running round to see everything they had to show with the young people. And as we were driving away, she was very thoughtful. And suddenly she turned to me and she said, "Grandmère, do you know anyone our ages at home who works as hard as that?" And I said, "No, I'm afraid I don't." But then most of our young people have forgotten that you're always building. They think that we have built our country. They don't realize that there is still much to be built. And she was a very thoughtful child. I think she learned an enormous amount in Israel. Incidentally, as you, perhaps some of you will remember, she bought a camel in Beersheba. I was a little troubled as to what I was going to do with the camel, what her parents would think, and also how we were going to get it home. So I very rapidly, she came in the camel market. She came across the field to me and said, "Oh, Grandma, I love a camel." I said, "Camels are not very nice animals." "Oh, this is a lovely one. All white." I said, "Yes, when they're young, they are all white." But she bought it with aided and abetted by a friend of ours who had joined us, who's a lawyer in Washington. And I was not too happy because I kept thinking what her father would say to me when I got her home. But I washed my hands of it by saying, "I am not buying this camel. You're buying the camel. You plan to get it home, and you cable your father." So she showed me the cable. She said, "Daddy dear, I've fallen in love with a camel. It's very sweet. It eats very little and drinks less." And then she got no answer, no word from her father, and she began to get a little worried. And we left Jerusalem, and she thought she'd really arranged to have the camel sent. Israeli Airlines had offered to bring it, and I was getting really quite worried. But we got to Paris, and there was a cable from the Department of Agriculture that said she couldn't have the camel because it came from an area where there might be hoof and mouth disease. That made the Israeli government not very happy because they say they don't have hoof and mouth disease. But nevertheless, it meant she couldn't bring the camel in, which was something that relieved me because I thought it would make life simpler when we got home. But at the same time, she got a letter from her father, and I thought it was a very wise letter. It said, "Dear Screwball, ever since I got your cable, Charlie and I," that's the man who works on our place at Hyde Park, "Charlie and I have been looking for a vet that knows about camels. We haven't yet found him, but we will keep on looking until we perhaps will find someone. We will do the best we can. We will love seeing you with or without the camel. We're very, very happy that you'll soon be home." And that made up for not being able to bring the camel. All of us were happy except her two younger sisters, who were very depressed because they had planned to have the camel on the lawn and give rides for pay to all their friends. But this was just an incident. Actually, she learned a great deal in Israel, and I think it must affect every American who goes there the way it does me and the way it did her. She came home with the realization that this small country was the one area in the Middle East which the United States could count on to actually stand up against infiltration of communism. There is no other country where the danger, not of war, but of the kind of infiltration which is done in an economic and cultural way, will not have an appeal for the masses of people who are miserable. When you have disease of all kinds, poverty, which is beyond our understanding until we've seen it, you have a kind of feeling as you go into Israel, oh, I'm back in a country I understand. I'm home again. This is something that I understand. And I was interested that it did come home to her that in the great overall struggle that we as a people are engaged in, this small country is vitally important to all of us. That's why I'm so grateful to all of you who have given so much to build the strength of Israel. And while, of course, they could not do without the gifts that you have given, I think the investment has been, if anything, more important because it gives a sense of self-respect and self-reliance to know that people believe in you enough to invest in you. And I think this has made a tremendous difference. It's not just what you've done in building up industry. Of course, you've done a great deal. And of course, those of you who have built plants there or seen that industries have started must have an enormous sense of pride in the way it grows. But I think the thing that means the most to me is what you've done for people. I happened to see some children who were unaccompanied in the first camp I ever saw in Germany. This was the first refugee camp I'd ever seen. And I probably would not have gone to see those camps in Germany at the end of the first meeting of the United Nations if I had not happened to have to make the fight for the right of the people in those camps to refuse to return to their countries of origin if they did not wish to. And my opponent, of course, was the representative of the Soviet Union. They said anyone who will not go home to their country of origin is a quisling or a traitor. But the fact that, of course, the countries had changed hands very often, had become different countries under a different ideological system. That, of course, the Soviets would not agree, made a difference to the people in the camps. But it did. And we fought in the United Nations in that first meeting in London for their right to choose where they would go and what they would do. And at the end of the session, when we had finally won our point, we thought we'd won it for a good. We didn't know at that time that you never really win with the Soviets. You go on arguing. And I argued that same point during the 6 years I was in the UN, every year with the Soviet delegates. But we always won. So the people did not have to go home. But at the end of the session I said, I've never seen these people in the camps that I've been talking about. I better go and look. So I asked for permission to be flown to Germany. it was quite a horrible trip for me, because I'd known Germany very well before the war. I'd been 3 years at school in England, and every holiday I had spent either in Germany or France or Italy. And to go back and see devastation, even of your enemy, after all, you were seeing what had happened to people. But nothing touched me the way the camps did. And in a camp called Wilsheim, some of you may remember, in that camp there were Jewish refugees. And I saw 2 children. One a boy who looked about 9 years old. They said he was 12. And one 6 years old, his little brother. They had come into camp unaccompanied, all alone, and they'd been questioned. They couldn't tell where they'd come from. They didn't know what had happened to any of their relatives. And I saw many of the people there, and I thought, these children can never grow up into normal children. It just is a mark they will carry all their lives. But later, I saw them in Israel. Several years later, to be sure. And they had grown healthy and strong and normal, and they were building Israel. These children had a sense that this land belonged to them, and that their work was important in that land. And I think perhaps the greatest thing you've done is to give a chance for these children to grow up to be normal and strong and healthy human beings. I've seen since, of course, children in Morocco, children in the camps of southern France. Many of them went unaccompanied to Israel, and all of them got the same kind of care, of loving care. And I think they will make among the best citizens that Israel has. This is a country which has, of course, done so many things that we would think impossible to do, that each time you go back you think, this is a miracle. How does it happen? How is it done? How do they accomplish it? To them, of course, it must seem long, hard work. But Israel has a great advantage. It has a great many people who are leaders, who are good organizers, who are good administrators. If the day ever comes when there is peace with the countries round about, it will be a blessing to those countries, because there will be people who can help them where they have no people that understand, at least to speak of, that understand organization and administration. And they need it more than anything. But I can only tell you that all you have invested, all you have done, is, from my point of view, as important to our safety in the United States as it is really a question of humanitarianism. Now, I know that you have done it without any idea, really, of doing anything except helping those of your people who have suffered greatly. But I look at it from the point of view of what it probably is going to mean to the world. We are engaged in a tremendous struggle. We here in the United States are very little aware of the struggle. We've been soothed into thinking that everything was going well. I happen to have been twice to the Soviet Union. They plan further ahead than we do. They don't want war. because they know it would mean a destroyed world and they want a going concern. And they also think that they can have a communist world without war, and they haven't done so badly. They think they can win with economic and cultural methods. And so every place in the world which you can count on is of enormous importance to us who try to lead the non-communist world without any real comprehension of what the challenge is that we face. It's a tremendous challenge from a country that can order its people to do what they want, and that does every single thing with a clear understanding of the value it has to the ultimate objective of bringing about a communist world. Israel is all important in the area of the world where it is to us as a nation. And I'm grateful as a citizen of the United States to you, who are all citizens of the United States, for recognizing what you are doing, not only for your people, but for your own country. I think it's a great double contribution. I couldn't thank you enough for what you've done for people of many lands and of one religion. But that's not all. I marvel at your generosity. I marvel at the interest you sustain. But I hope you will long sustain it. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart.